Good morning and welcome to the fourth of our videocast series on waiting on God. Today I want to talk about a couple of times in Luke's Gospel where Jesus devotes time to waiting on God. But before I do, I just want to say something about where we're going with this. The reason I think it's so important to wait on God is because all kinds of good possibilities open up when people wait on God. It's a way of getting back in touch with the living God, and He is the creative God. He is the God who only does wondrous things. One of the characteristics of a well-lived Christian life is that every so often that life will catch you by surprise. And it will catch you by surprise because God is creative and surprising. One of the things that happens which is very important, is waiting on God changes our minds. And when I say waiting on God changes our minds, I mean it changes our attitudes, but it also influences our decision making in very important ways. We gain wisdom. A lot of very foolish or empty notions somehow get deflated, like a balloon running out of air, when God, in His wisdom, changes our minds as we wait on Him. And sometimes newer and better, more wise, more creative thoughts do come into our lives as we wait on God. And I want to look at how this worked in the life of Jesus in particularly three moments. One of those moments I'm saving for tomorrow. That is the time when Jesus waited on God in the Garden of Gethsemane. I want to leave that because it's such an important and valuable piece of the Bible. I think it deserves its own attention. But today I want to talk about Luke chapter 5:16, and then a little bit about Luke chapter 6, verse 11 to 13. In Luke 5:16, we find out that Jesus had a funny habit. When he was immensely popular up in Galilee, when everybody wanted a piece of Jesus, when he was doing so many healing miracles and saying such wonderful things, the crowds would gather all the time. If Jesus had had a publicity agent, that agent would have told him, "This is your busy time. Make sure you make the most of this popularity." But what Jesus did every so often was he went missing in action. He disappeared off into the wilderness. Let me read it to get it right. Luke 16, the news about Jesus spread all the more, and great crowds came to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. Yet he frequently withdrew to the wilderness to pray. He frequently withdrew to the wilderness to pray. Now, we're not talking about a daily quiet time here. We're talking about a journey from the populated areas of Galilee out towards the eastern wilderness, the other side of Jordan, the other side of the Sea of Galilee. When it says he frequently withdrew, that withdrawing would be a day's walk. And after that day's walk, he would then spend time with God. Luke isn't clear how long he would spend there, but he just says he withdrew to pray. And he points it out because it's such unusual behaviour. Most Christian ministers, evangelists, if they find they've got a huge season of productivity, would not necessarily do this. Some would, I'm sure, some wise people would. But this is what he's doing. Jesus is consciously withdrawing from the crowd, withdrawing from his ministry, going out into the lonely desert out east of where he's ministering, and he would pray. Why would he do it? Well, it seems to have been something to do with keeping in touch with God, with his Father. There's another example in Luke chapter 6, 11, 13, where Jesus is facing the hatred of the religious authorities, the scribes and the Pharisees. So I'm going to read that. The scribes and Pharisees were filled with rage and began to discuss with one another what they might do to Jesus. Do to Jesus. We know what that means, don't we? In those days, Jesus went out to the mountain to pray, and he spent the night in prayer to God. When daylight came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also designated as apostles. I just want to point out what a historically huge moment that is, that decision making. Jesus calling his disciples and choosing from among them the 12, who he would call the apostles. Because the apostles were the men who had the huge responsibility of, first of all, building, maintaining, and revealing the whole Christian tradition. Let me remind you that the only Jesus you will ever know is the Jesus of the apostles. They were the writers of the Bible. They were the founders of the tradition of Christ, a tradition which Paul says he entered into and which the early church was, on the whole, very faithful to. But those 12 men were crucial. They were the foundation stones, and Jesus himself was the cornerstone of the foundation they laid. That was a huge decision, wasn't it? And before making that decision, Jesus sees the opposition, the hatred, the rage, and his answer to that rage is to establish the Christian faith on the shoulders of those 12 men. And to do that, before he did it, he withdrew. He seems to have had a habit of going up hills at night time when big events were about to occur. And he waited on God. Luke just says he prayed, but I'm going to say Luke's word praying, it's that very broad word for prayer. It could mean anything really. I think he did more than just talk to God. I think he waited on God. And that's why I'm using this as an example. And of course we know about Luke 9, the famous events of the Transfiguration. We sometimes forget that it begins with Jesus going up a mountain to pray. Again, a key moment in Jesus' ministry. The Gospel writers connect it with the moment when Jesus' ministry changes from being mainly an announcement about his kingship to becoming an announcement about his death and his sacrifice. It's a turning point in the Gospels. It's clearest in Mark's Gospel, but it's there in the others as well. Jesus is going up the mountain to wait on God because he's going to start talking seriously now about how he's going to save the world by dying on a cross. And again, he goes up a mountain. Now, what happens there is a wonderful, wonderful transformation. And I'm going to make a connection in a further talk between that and a passage in 2 Corinthians. But for now, all I want to say is the Transfiguration events all begin with Jesus going up to spend time with God. So what Luke calls praying, I will call waiting on the Lord. Jesus did it. Now Jesus is sinless, but he is like us in every other way. Like us, he accepted the limitations of being a human being, and he proved that it is possible to live a limited life before God without sin. He did it. He's the only person who has done it. But a key part of Jesus' successful walk with God were those times when he drew apart, when he went off, when he went missing in action, when he waited on the Lord. And we should give thanks that that model is for us in the life of Jesus. That's what I want to say today. Tomorrow we'll carry on with looking at Jesus waiting on the Lord in the Garden of Gethsemane and see what that has to tell us about him and about ourselves. But for now, I just want to say, may God bless you and keep you. May his face shine upon you as you wait on the Lord. Goodbye.